Hungry Trilobyte podcast would like to start by acknowledging these fine conventions.
SoonerCon. Central Oklahoma's longest-running pop culture convention is back. SoonerCon 31 is scheduled for June 30th through July 2nd, 2023, in Norman, Oklahoma. It promises a weekend full of tabletop gaming, cosplay, and appreciation for literary sci-fi as well as TV and comics. Visit SoonerCon.com for more information. The Hellmouth Convention. The Hellmouth Convention is designed by fans for fans, with the aim of harnessing the power of fandom to raise money for charities. The Hellmouth Convention celebrates all fandoms, but particularly things like Buffy, Firefly, and Dr. Horrible. Like the Hellmouth itself, things gravitate toward it that you may not find anywhere else. The next event is scheduled for June 9th through 11th, 2023 in Los Angeles, California.
On tap today, we have Richard C. Meehan Jr. How you doing today?
Doing great. How about yourself?
Doing fantastic. I'm looking over your book here, Ford the Pacholet, and it is a Revolutionary War novel, the American Revolutionary War, in case I have to be specific for anybody listening from outside the country. And I'm a history fan myself, so I'm digging this big time.
Well, I appreciate that. Now, I'm going to say that the spelling of the name Pacholet is with a CH, only because that's the way it was spelled on ancient maps. So we're going to pronounce that Pacholet.
Yeah.
And there is a town of Pacholet, so I don't want to get them all upset.
And I made a deliberate attempt to try and get that right and still flubbed it. So it is what it is.
No problem. Well, this book is about the American Revolution in Spartanburg County, South Carolina, back in 1780, 81, 82. We were kind of taking a big hit from the British during that time period. And where I'm sitting right now, the major battle, the turning point of the war, the Battle of Cowpens, occurred, and the Cowpens is about 11 miles to my north. But the characters in my book were real people that lived about 20 miles from the Cowpens on a river nearby called the Pacholet River. Now, no one really knows where the name Pacholet came from. It was not an Indian name as far as any historian has been able to find. The best that has been found is that there was a French settler at one time, and he might have pronounced his name Pacholet, that perhaps settled in the town of Pacholet area. So this is upstate South Carolina. We're called the Piedmont. We're at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's a beautiful, lush area. The property of Grendel Shoals, which is on the Pacholet River, is a long lost location at this point in history. But back about 40 years ago, my father, myself, and two of his best hunting buddies put together the Grendel Shoals Partnership, which is a hunting club. And they are on the north side of the Pacholet River at the actual ford. The ford road, old foundations of buildings are still on the property. And the property used to be owned by a Lord Chesney from England. During the January of 1781, Daniel Morgan of the Continental Army, with many of the volunteer soldier militia from our area, were encamped for about 3 weeks. And this small frontier community had to host more than 500 men from one army for 3 weeks, and then about 1,000 men passing through on the way to the Battle of Cowpens from the British Legion. So you've got 300 people-ish with their families and children. Some of them were loyalists to the king, they were called Tories. And some of them were Whigs or patriots on the side of America being a free nation of its own. These people lived as neighbors. They fought against each other. They fought father to son in some cases, where one or the other was a Whig or a Tory in the same family. The women were also fighting in their own ways, sometimes as spies, sometimes as passing messages, sometimes as just trying to prevent the children from getting hurt. There were many instances on the Grindal Shoals property itself and around it of the small community doing whatever they could to survive.
There's a lot to unpack there, and I really love getting into this because I'm a fan of history myself. We don't get into the Revolutionary War quite as much as we have some of the the Civil War and World War II, to a lesser extent World War I. We've really fleshed that out in the media a lot the last 15, 20 years. But the American Revolutionary War, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing there was a lot of world building done because it's long enough ago now that the modern mind has trouble remembering the way people lived at that time. And you do a great job of getting into the details of what life was like then to contrast how the changes were affecting people.
Well, I appreciate that. One of the things that I wanted to do is make a story that's not a straight history, but I wanted it to be historically accurate. So I actually was parsed by the former park ranger out at the Cowpens National Battleground, John Robertson, checked the book over for me for accuracy. Those folks out at the park these days are extremely knowledgeable. They've been well versed in all of the extreme details of the battle and the site. But Robertson spent a lot of time traipsing across South Carolina, checking out all of the battle sites. And for your audience to know, the South Carolina had more battles than all of the 12 other colonies combined. So I'm plotting a map right now for my next book, and I've got over 300 points on it where skirmishes, battles, and murders occurred. So, when you look on your map, you'll see that South Carolina is not the largest of states. It's not the smallest either, but we took the brunt of the war in the Southern campaign of 1780 and 81.
And that's the kind of detail that I really think is beneficial to the story. And it's kind of a good jumping off point to the next thing I was pondering as I was reading through it here. It's so tempting to, like you said, make a straight history book. But at the same time, when you want to engage the reader and you want to tell just a good story, and you're cognizant of the fact that you're working with the lives of actual people, actual historical figures, the details of which are uncertain, how do you decide what liberties to take and how you decide what facts are too important to throw away?
Well, thankfully, governments keep records on everybody. So the British were no different than we are today. They had records on where people got their land, where they lived, how many kids were, they knew everything about you, pretty much the way they do now. So you can actually go, one of my favorite places to go is ancestry.com. I'm sure that a lot of your folks have done some, checking out of the family. Where did they come from? Who are they related to? And when you take a character that is recorded in history, like Daniel Morgan, for instance, you can easily go to ancestry.com and find out who he's related to, find out some family stories about him. That was the case by accident. I learned that over 30 years ago. before the web was really the web, found it in the library. There was a book about Grendel Shoals. There's only one to my knowledge. There was a pamphlet written by a Grendel Shoals resident, but the pamphlet has long since disappeared. So the fellow that wrote about that, he had walked up and down the riverbanks, meeting these frontiers folks that are living in their cabins and on their small farms. And he interviewed people that were essentially the grandchildren of the folks that fought the Battle of Cowpens and were alive at the time. So he had some people who were witnesses. One woman in particular married a judge. And so he was famous in the South Carolina Senate for a while. So her records were recorded in his book. And those tales, just to give you a for instance, evidently there was smallpox going on in her neighborhood at the time. And the Tories were raiding homes, taking everything they could take. All the food, all the animals, the cows, the chickens, the pigs, the whole works, clothing. They'd take the bedding, they'd strip them down so that people could not exist without having to get help. They were hoping that the people would get help from the British. It was a way to get them to trade sides and become Tories. So they would strip them down. In many cases, they would burn their homes. The women and children here, they are parked in their barn or their corn crib, trying to keep warm in the dead of winter. And their husbands are off fighting skirmishes. So
I'm glad you brought up the fact that this war split people down the middle, that you brother against brother, father against son, and so on, because people who don't follow history that much tend to get the idea that the only time that happened in our nation's past was the Civil War. A brother against brother is it's the motto that you kind of attribute to it. But we only say that, we don't say that about the Revolutionary War only because we won. And we like to have this idea that the whole nation at once just decided we were done with Britain and that was that. And it was not nearly that clean.
There was nothing clean about a civil war.
No.
We have a South Carolina historian, very famous. His name is Walter Edgar. He's been around for quite a number of years, historian at the University of South Carolina. One of the favorite things, I've seen many of his videos and read several of his books. One of the favorite things that he likes to point out is, perhaps you remember the scene in the movie The Patriot, where Mel Gibson had a young son, probably 14, 15 years old. The British came to their home, and the British officer did not like the surliness of the boy or the father, and he shot the boy in front of his father. And many times I saw in videos with Walter Edgar, he was asked, well, was that really something that would have happened? And he was very careful to say that they would not have wasted the bullet and the gunpowder. Instead, they would have sabered him. So many atrocities occurred on both sides. After reading much documentation, I believe that I think that the Tories kind of began that deal, but hey, when it starts, you have to protect yourself. And so a lot of people got hurt. And yes, the Civil War is a little younger for us. We got a lot more of that in our history classes in school, but I'd be willing to bet that the only thing that you can remember from the American Revolution is probably the midnight ride of Paul Revere and George Washington crossing the Delaware, and all of his men trying to freeze to death at Valley Forge, because that's what we were taught, and that was the only thing we were taught.
And there's so many people, and I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but I want to encourage people to look into just how fascinating this stretch of time is, because we talked about the Civil War, and that was long and short about 4 years, and we've got the Revolutionary War. People are going to be like, well, 1782, wasn't everything over by then? Because they think 1776 is when everything was wrapped up, and that's not even close to, that was just when the ball got rolling. It took years and years of fighting to get to the point where we could pull the nation together. And that a lot happened in the atrocities you mentioned, the battles, just the idea of trying to come up with a plan took many years, and the country suffered. Children grew up they spent their whole childhood in this time just watching this happen around them.
Yes, it did. Now, one of the interesting stories that I ran up on was about our seventh president, Andrew Jackson. It turns out that Andrew Jackson, at 13 years old in 1780, and his brother at 12, were working as messengers and scouts for Sumter's Whig militias. So that literally is about 30 miles from my house, in an area called Upper Fishing Creek, South Carolina. Fishing Creek is off of the Catawba River, I believe. And there were several big churches, meeting houses in the area. Now, have you ever heard about the involvement of the Presbyterian ministers in the American Revolution?
I have to say, I have not heard about this.
Well, for anybody that wants to pursue that a little bit, all they have to do is go to YouTube and type in the Black Robe Regiment, and they will get several very interesting videos that explain why the Presbyterian ministers were involved in the war and what they were preaching from their pulpits. But there was a fellow named Reverend John Simpson here in South Carolina that actually served several of the meeting houses. He traveled around. He was an itinerant preacher. And when the atrocities occurred at the Battle of Waxhaws, Waxhaws is spelled Waxhaw apostrophe S, Waxhaws. The massacre of Buford's Patriot militia by quote unquote bloody band Tarleton, as the Whigs like to call the British Legion commander. It was a true massacre. I'll let you look up the details on that particular battle. It's very interesting. But fact is, Buford was defeated. It was very bloody. It made the pastors in the area very upset. And essentially, from the pulpits, they began preaching that it was going to be God's will that the Americans were to turn back this enemy of the people for what had been done. So that, I believe, is probably the main instigation for the folks up here in the Piedmont to fight the British. The pastors were preaching it from the pulpit, saying that it was God's will. And they give all kinds of excellent reasons why they felt that was the case. But let me put it to you this way. Whether you're religious or not, I'm Christian, and I believe that these pastors were trying to do the right thing for their people, their congregation. Whether you're a Christian or not, the fact remains that these preachers took up arms themselves and went out and stood up for this country. They took their congregations in whole with them. And those congregations fought the British off to a standstill here in South Carolina at the Battle of Cowpens. And that turned the war around.
I wasn't trying to ignore you. I was actually taking a minute to write all that down because I want to put that video and those historical notes in the show notes on my website. aaronbossig.com. Somebody goes ahead and looks up the notes so they can get a handle on your book, they can go ahead and get those links there too as well. It's interesting you bring that up, because in the episode that immediately precedes this one, I got into a great conversation with Janine Michaelis, another author, and we talked about how the difference between somebody who is writing just something completely out of their own imagination, and somebody who is taking the trappings of a certain faith and using that as the basis for their story. Because when they do the latter, they have to be mindful of the fact that some of their audience is going to assume that that faith has meaning in their life, and they'll interpret the story accordingly. And some of the audience is going to reject that idea, and they're going to interpret the story accordingly. So they have to have that. They have to keep both of those things in mind. And I'm wondering, like I said, when somebody hears about the Black Robe Regiment, and they're going to say, well, can you presume that it was God's will? Well, maybe you can, maybe you can't, but the people of the time did, and that's the important thing.
And that, I believe, is the key. It was a different time, and there was no such thing as, quote unquote, the separation of church and state. And if they research on the Black Robe Regiment, they're going to find out that the British were using that as a derogatory term for the preachers. Now, the other thing about the Christianity at the time, most of the settlers that were coming in were Christian. They were Scotch-Irish, German, but they were fleeing their countries because of political and religious persecution. That's why they came here, to get away from that. And the British kind of tried to bring it all back. So that wasn't going to happen. The majority of the militia folks were Scotch-Irish Presbyterian. And also up north, up there where Washington was fighting, that was the case as well. And one of the videos that those folks will look up on the Black Robe Regiment is about a northern pastor. So
very interesting. And seeing,
I guess I should try to answer your question a little better.
No, that's fine.
I did not make religion the focus of the book. However, you can't get around that the family was Scotch-Irish, and that they had a meeting house, and that the father was most likely one of the elders of the house. Okay, meaning that he served on Sundays. He might have even preached. So the family Bible is extremely important at the time. The family Bible records the history of the family coming over from England, who the births and deaths were, going back into ancient history. So the Bible was kept on the safest place in the house, right below the gun on the mantelpiece.
Yeah, I wasn't meaning to imply that you were making that the focus of the book, but I do find it being a very, when something means something that much to somebody, that it motivates them to make a story or even base their belief system around it. It's a force I want to look at, because what you're saying, this is a force that moved entire countries to justify taking up arms against the government that was ruling them at the time. There were people who were on the fence about it, who thought, okay, well, if the pastor's behind this, so am I. And likewise, there are people who will make a story that just has a few trappings of their faith, but isn't really meant to be a guiding life lesson. And I think there's room in the world for both ways of looking at things.
I would suggest that, remember I mentioned Dr. Walter Edgar? Get hold of this book called Partisans and Redcoats by Dr. Walter Edgar.
Mm-hmm.
The Brattonsville folks have a park around the battlefield itself up in York County. They have a wonderful book called The Day It Rained Militia by Michael Scoggins. And he details the entire upstate experience through the Battle of Brattonsville itself. Wonderful reads for folks that want to know the true history. Now, again, one of the things that I wanted to make sure of is that I presented true history, not only in this first book, Ford the Pacholet, but I'm planning to do the series the same way. I want the history to the best of my knowledge. I've got about 20 resources open here, not to mention who knows how many web sources. The first book alone has over 300 sources, and many of those were eyewitness accounts. So I wanted to present the story in a way that would be fun to read, as in nobody wants to read dates and times and who did what and this, that, and the other. You know, history is great for school, but when you just want to have a leisurely read, you need Ford the Pacholet.
And let's not forget that if we go back, not that far back in the past, when, you know, before people could really read on their own, before widespread literacy was a thing, when people would hear about their own history, they would hear about it in the form of oral tales, songs, or just, you know, stories that would bubble up from their own communities. They would hear it in the form of the entertainment they wanted, and it wasn't always 100% accurate. Sometimes it wasn't even very accurate at all, but it would communicate the important stuff. It would communicate the stuff that they were trying to teach their children or even each other. And so what we're dealing with now is not that different.
That's true. And one of my rules of thumb is to make sure that at least 3 of my sources are in agreement, and as many sources as I can find on the same subject material. Thankfully, folks did something different back then. They didn't have TV, they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have the internet. So they wrote. They wrote lots of letters, they wrote memoirs, and they wrote books. So that material is still out there. You just have to dig for it. And for instance, the Spartanburg County Library has a room called the Kennedy Room. The Kennedy Room is devoted to materials specifically about South Carolina. And when I was at Wofford College in 1982, I had to use that room for one of my English courses. And that's when I located the book about Grendel Shoals. 10 years later, I became involved in the property of Grendel Shoals for the hunting club. And I thought about that original book and I said, wow, I think I'm going to find out everything I can about it. Now I've got a 2-foot-high stack of material about Daniel Morgan, Lord Alexander Chesney, all of the relatives and ancestors and families and friends and nephews and stuff that are still alive, living right there at the Ford. And Pacholet is a very small town.
That's really awesome. And I have to ask, as probably as to wrap this up, because my curiosity as somebody who loves to research is getting to me. When you go from one book that you just kind of passed over once in your life to a 2-foot stack of material, when you're compiling this, is it important to you or super relevant to you to get academic sources, or are you just glad to find anything? At what stage do you start to weed out what's credible versus not, and how does that process go in your head?
Well, originally, I was simply wanting to find out any stories about Daniel Morgan and camping on the property that we now owned. And once I got some names to look up, I was able to find more detail. Spartanburg, where I live, is named after the first Spartan regiment of militia. The town of Spartan might have had 14 cabins when it started back in 1780, 81. by 1785, it was incorporated, and our town now has around 300,000 people in the county. So I went from there and talked to quite a number of very knowledgeable folks. We tend to overlook our county museums. Fairfield County Museum is a wonderful group of people and resources on historical folks from their neighborhood. Spartanburg also. York County Museum, Cherokee County Museum. All these folks have knowledgeable people in charge that you can talk to, and I highly recommend it. But one of the things that I discovered along the way was the Bobby Moss collection of all known patriot soldiers in the American Revolution. And it's like 14 4-stack high file cabinets of soldiers, every one of them's record, everything that this man was able to find about these soldiers. And I was able to go, and a couple of the characters in my book, Sergeant James Park and his Major Joseph McJunkin, their service record information is in those file cabinets. It's incredible. Once you get started on this path, you may not be able to quit.
And that's why I love research, because it becomes more and more rewarding the further in you go.
I agree.
No, Richard, thank you so much for doing this. I have really enjoyed this chat. I've really enjoyed the book. So I want to say you're welcome back anytime. Where can people follow your adventures on the internet?
Well, on this particular book, go to fordthepacholet.com. Just remember that it's spelled Pacholet, the old spelling of Pacholet River, fordthepacholet.com. They can also go to nogginuniverse.com. That is the publisher. Noggin is in your head. Noggin.
Well, if all else fails, I will have that information and more on my website, aaronbossig.com. Rick, thanks again.